Hi. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the reasons why we're currently watching the global economy collapse in real time, whether it's reasonable to expect that advances in AI technology will inevitably lead to the salvation of humanity, and why both capitalism and communism fail when labor scarcity is removed from the equation. Finally, I'm going to explain why I think that it's possible to design a system of social organization that would produce an outcome of universal human flourishing, and I'm going to describe what I think that system would look like. I saw a video clip recently of Elon Musk predicting that artificial intelligence and robotics will soon eliminate all jobs, ushering in a difficult transition period of economic collapse, which will ultimately result in universal high income and techno-utopia for all. I've heard a lot of people express different variations of this idea recently. It seems to be the prevailing vision for the future of humanity at this point, but it doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't logically follow that just because we create artificial intelligence, it will ultimately lead to utopia. I think it's just as likely that we end up extinct or back at the Stone Age. It feels like magical thinking to assume that everything will just work out for us somehow. Regardless of that, this seems to be the best vision that any of our leaders has to offer at this point, which is terrifying. I have some ideas to share that I think could help us come up with a better plan for the transition to a post-labor scarcity world. I think, for one thing, there's this assumption that if artificial intelligence hasn't yet solved all of the problems of humanity, it must be because the technology hasn't sufficiently advanced. And so the path forward must be to continue to try to make AI more powerful. Realistically, we've had the technology available to us for a long time to solve many of the problems facing humanity. One example is the housing crisis. The problem is not a lack of technology to build more houses. It's a resource allocation issue and a systems problem. If you start giving some people free houses, it causes a lot of unintended economic consequences. Homes will lose value, and some people may be happy because they received a free house, but other people will be mad because they didn't receive a free house. It's obviously more complicated than that, but the point I'm trying to make here is that it's not a lack of technology that's holding us back from creating utopia. It's something else. Especially once you get to a point where you're literally replacing all human labor with machines. I'm not sure there's a case to be made for the idea that the biggest problem facing humanity is a lack of sufficiently advanced artificial intelligence technology. Think about it this way. Even if you had a magic genie that could give you anything you could ask for, you still have to know what to ask for. When the possibilities are infinite, you're not likely to end up creating utopia by accident. I suppose anything's possible, but the chances of that happening randomly are quite small. In order to come up with a better plan, I think it may be helpful to more precisely frame the question that we're trying to answer. We need to understand what conditions are necessary to support human flourishing at the individual level, and beyond that, we have to understand what kind of societal structure would be necessary to enable those conditions to exist simultaneously for every human on planet Earth. Is it possible? I think it is, and I also think we should at least consider the possibility that we've already arrived at a level of technological advancement that would allow us to start to intentionally build that if only we knew precisely what it is that we're trying to build. I think that the key to solving this problem is to find a way to structure society so that the more something benefits humanity and the planet, the more it benefits the individual. The incentive structure has to be in alignment with the good of humanity as a whole. A lot of people probably think that this is impossible because it's never been achieved in the history of civilization, as far as I know. Any economic system that's been tried has always produced misaligned incentive structures. I think that it becomes possible with labor automation, though, and I'm going to explain why. On the surface, it seems like there are two paths that humanity could take from here: the capitalist option and the communist option. First, I'm going to walk through the reasons why neither of these options will work once labor is automated, and then I'm going to describe a potential third option and explain why I think it would work. The first option is that we let the free market decide what happens, and we don't try to exert any government control on the tech companies or enact laws to limit what they do at all. We just let them build as many data centers as they want and eliminate all of our jobs and trust that the invisible hand of the free market will continue to efficiently allocate resources. This doesn't make much sense in a world where human labor no longer has any value. Imagine if I don't own any assets that I can trade for the things that I need, and I don't own any land that I could use to start a farm and grow my own food. What could I possibly trade in order to get the things that I need? I have this one extra kidney that I don't really need, but once that one's gone, I kind of need all of my remaining organs, so that's not a long-term solution. People will suggest UBI as a solution to this problem, but I don't think that UBI can solve this problem. Because the only kind of currency that can just be conjured out of thin air to hand out to people is fiat currency. And the only reason that fiat currency has value, or that anyone would be willing to trade away scarce physical resources in exchange for fiat currency is, well, people usually say that it's because of the full faith and credit of the government that issued the fiat currency, but I don't think that that's precise enough. What's really underlying the value of fiat currency is the expectation that you will be able to trade it for goods or services that you will need in the future. The unspoken assumption here is that those goods or services only exist because someone labored to create, harvest, or deliver them. At its core, a dollar is a transferable claim on someone else's future labor. There's no way to physically possess someone's future labor, and the only way to trade or store that is to trade or store the promise of it. And that is what fiat currency is. It is a social technology that transforms someone's future labor into something tangible that can be traded or stored. Obviously, in a post-labor economy, that underlying assumption is no longer true. No one has to expend labor to produce anything, and the real bottleneck to producing something is access to the physical resources and raw materials needed to produce it. And so for that reason, it doesn't make any sense for anyone to trade away anything of real value in exchange for UBI tokens. They would just trade their extra resources for something else of value, like silver or land or other raw materials, because those things are actually scarce and valuable, and no one can just print more of them anytime they decide to. So that is the free market option and why it doesn't make any sense. The other option that people talk about is we could do some kind of centrally planned totalitarianism situation in which everyone is under constant surveillance and we get our daily allotment of bug protein and we're each assigned a tiny house that we can live in, and we get some tokens periodically that we can use for trips in one of the government-owned self-driving cars, and we will own nothing and be happy, because if we start complaining that we're not happy, some robot in a van might show up and disappear us. I don't know about you, but neither of those options sounds like utopia to me. The totalitarianism thing sounds marginally better in the sense that it may keep us alive for longer, but it's still not great. There's also a pretty big danger that people will fight to the death to avoid being imprisoned that way, because it violates their autonomy. So what do we do? What other options are there? The important thing to realize here is that capitalism and communism are both labor allocation strategies. That is the problem that they were created to solve. The need for labor allocation strategies arose as a result of the transition from hunting and gathering to agrarian societies, due to the massive increase in the amount of labor required to produce enough calories for all the humans as a result of this transition. In a hunter-gatherer society, the average adult spends about 4 hours a day doing required work that must be done in order to survive. That is our ancestral environment. That is what we evolved to be able to cope with. And even that, if we could find a way to work less, we would prefer to work less than that, because work does not give our lives meaning. That's just a lie we told ourselves to help us cope with the level of overwork required to maintain our society. Anyway, if the level of collective human labor required to maintain your society, when divided evenly among all of the able-bodied adults, exceeds what humans are capable of without sacrificing their well-being, It creates an incentive for individuals to find ways to avoid doing their fair share of that work, because that's the only way that they can get out of being forced to work beyond their capacity. So you get things like slavery, which is another labor allocation strategy, and also feudalism and conquering foreign lands and extracting tribute from them. Those are pretty high conflict ways of allocating labor. The people being exploited are probably going to try to fight you about it, so it takes even more work to enforce it on them. Plus, enslaving people feels kind of gross. Because of that, the tendency is towards systems that abstract away the fact that at the core of what is happening is some people are being coerced into doing more than their fair share of the work so that other people are able to benefit from doing less of it. The system functions more efficiently and with less conflict if people are able to lie to themselves about what is happening. If the people winning can plausibly tell themselves that their advantage was legitimately earned and it's a fair system in which anyone could succeed, they won't feel bad for winning. And the losers in that system can tell themselves that one day maybe they'll be winners. That gives them hope, which can keep a person going through incredibly difficult situations. Communism sounds fair on paper, but in practice, every time it's been tried, it's become kind of a nightmare. One big problem with communism is that someone still has to do all the work. And the reason communism fails so much more quickly and completely than capitalism is because there's no functioning incentive structure. There's no effective mechanism to coerce people into working beyond their capacity. So the work necessary to provide for everyone's needs doesn't even get done. All of that to say, communism and capitalism were created to solve a problem that no longer exists in a post-labor scarcity world. We don't need labor allocation strategies because we don't need to allocate labor. What we need is a resource allocation strategy. Fully automated luxury communism is basically a resource allocation strategy, but it's not necessarily going to solve all of our problems on its own, because how do you decide how much each person should have? We can't just let everyone have whatever they want, can we? We're already causing a huge mass extinction and setting off feedback loops that could result in most of the planet becoming completely unlivable for us at our current level of consumption. If we let everyone consume an unlimited amount of stuff, won't we just accelerate that? Obviously, the elimination of labor scarcity is not the same thing as having infinite abundance of everything. The earth is still finite, natural resources are still finite, and people seem to never be satisfied no matter how much they have, so we can't just let everyone have whatever they ask for, can we? But we also can't imprison everyone in a digital gulag and force them to eat bugs, especially an armed populace like we have in America. People hate that idea. They hate having their autonomy infringed that way, and they'll probably not just peacefully accept it. Something to note here is that humans seem to be hardwired to form social hierarchies, which is why it occurs in pretty much any group of people anywhere. You have some individuals who have more social influence than others, and people seem to be motivated to move up the hierarchy just for the sake of moving up the hierarchy. Our social hierarchy right now is mostly based on economic success, which causes a misaligned incentive structure. Visibly having expensive things confers social status. And also, the more you can accumulate relative to others, the more power and autonomy you have. Individuals are incentivized to keep accumulating more even when they very obviously have enough for a comfortable life. The thing is, they're not chasing survival or comfort, they are chasing status. And that explains some of the overconsumption. But it's possible for a social hierarchy to exist that is based on something pro-social, like how entertaining or pleasant someone is to be around, or how good their ideas are, or how skilled they are at telling stories or playing music or something. That would be ideal because people would be incentivized to improve themselves and improve the world that they live in. That's probably the kind of hierarchy that would naturally emerge once you eliminate economic inequality. And then overconsumption as a means of signaling social status would not be a thing anymore. The other factor I think could be driving a lot of our senseless overconsumption of resources is that we have needs that are impossible or nearly impossible to meet in our current social structure. So much so that we've come up with all kinds of stories to convince ourselves that these things aren't even really needs and that they're luxuries. I'm talking about things like adequate rest, leisure time, the autonomy to explore things that interest us, community and belonging, and the reasonable expectation that our survival needs will continue to be met in the future. Our chronic time scarcity is likely a big factor in the loneliness epidemic. People say, if you want a friend, be a friend. If you want a community, go be a community for someone else. But most of us don't have time or energy to be a community for each other because we're all working so much. Plus, inequality makes us suspicious of each other. You don't want to let people get too close because they might judge you or they might be jealous of you. Another thing is something called Dunbar's number. An anthropologist came up with this idea back in 1990. Derived from the correlation between primate brain size and group size, it represents the maximum number of individuals with whom a human can have trust and mutual obligation. There are some criticisms. It's not universally accepted as fact, but I think Dunbar may have been onto something here. The way we live these days in cities surrounded by strangers is stressful for us and makes it harder to connect with each other because we encounter an overwhelming number of people when we go outside. Plus, a lot of us have to move away from our families and communities of origin for economic reasons, for jobs. It's really difficult for most adults to build a community with people they have no shared history with. I think that most people would agree that it's much easier to make friends as a child than it is as an adult. We didn't evolve in an environment in which we had to abandon our communities and go build new communities with random strangers in foreign places multiple times over the course of our lifetimes. And we're not very good at it. I think that it's possible that a lot of our endless overconsumption of resources is a coping mechanism for dealing with the suffering caused by loneliness, lack of community, lack of autonomy to choose where we want to live or how we spend our time, as well as the never-ending economic precarity required to sufficiently motivate us to keep working harder. Most of us have no hope of realistically solving these problems for ourselves. But what we do have is Amazon Prime. So if that's the only lever you can pull to exercise autonomy, you just keep pulling it over and over again. I think it's likely that these problems will largely solve themselves if technology can give people back their autonomy. When I say autonomy, I'm talking about freedom from economic coercion. The autonomy to decide how you want to spend your time and energy based on what's important to you, rather than being forced to choose based on what will get you more money. Something else I think is important is cultural autonomy. The autonomy of a community to choose their own values, what holidays they celebrate, what kind of social expectations they think are important. And then, of course, the autonomy of individuals to choose where they live based on who they want to live close to, and not based on some external economic factors. People should be able to choose their communities intentionally based on shared values. Individuals should have the autonomy to leave a community and go join or start another one if they no longer want to adhere to the prevailing cultural norms of their community, or for any other reason. The future I imagine for humanity is a network of autonomous, self-governing communities that share ideas and collaborate on bigger projects. Obviously, some things will still be scarce, like beach vacations. There's a limit to how many people can physically be on the beach at once, and maybe we would have to work together to allocate that, or to create other competing destinations or experiences that could reduce the demand for beach vacations to a manageable level. I also think that if people lived in physically discrete communities, it's important that we find a way that individuals can travel between those communities and other destinations they might want to visit that doesn't fragment the natural environment. You want untamed nature to be continuous between those communities to support biodiversity. Maybe this could be achieved with raised railways that allow animals to pass freely from one side to the other without getting hit by cars. Or maybe the solution could be some type of small aircraft, if that can be done without harming migrating birds. These are the kinds of problems I see us working on solving together with the help of AI. I acknowledge that even if this sounds great to everyone, we still have to figure out how we can get from here to there. The important thing to realize is that once automation technology exists that is capable of creating anything that it is asked to create, the bottleneck becomes access to the physical resources necessary to facilitate that creation. People need to be able to access land and raw materials so they can go build their own communities in whatever way the members of that community can agree on together. Currently, all of the land and resources on this planet are owned by individuals or corporations or governments. It would be naive to expect that people are just going to voluntarily give away the stuff they own. So what can we do about that? Is there a way to force people to give up their hoarded resources for the good of the collective? I don't think that's a good idea, but I also don't think that it's necessary. I think we just need enough resources to be volunteered to start building this. If the technology was developed that could enable a group of individuals to build a self-sustaining, independent community with robots doing all of the work, and people could see that their lives would improve as a result of using this technology to create their own independent community, they would voluntarily abandon all of their hoarded resources in order to go and do that instead. They would technically still own the stuff they'd left behind, but that ownership wouldn't be enforced in any way because there wouldn't be anyone left who cared about enforcing it. There wouldn't be any police officers or judges or lawyers. Everyone who used to do those jobs would be gone, creating their own communities with whoever they wanted to create them with. Eventually, no one would even remember where the border of this country used to be or who used to own that piece of land or that building. Pretty soon, all of our current political entities would fade into obscurity, and everything that feels so real to us now would just become some crazy stories that we tell each other about how people used to live back before the singularity. If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.